The true story of the Unbroken. The story begins in 1942, after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor pulled America into World War II. The U.S. was desperate for revenge, and so many U.S. Navy B-25 torpedo bomber aircraft were sent to destroy Japanese submarines in the South Pacific. Among them was an aircraft carrying 3 men, pilot Harold, bombardier Tony, and radio man Gene. As they were returning, flying high above the clouds, they lost their way. Their fuel tank was slowly emptying. Gene desperately tried to contact someone on the radio for directions, but due to poor signal, he couldn't hear clearly. Suddenly, he heard a Japanese voice on the radio. He quickly pulled out the radio wire and sent a message via Morse code, but their fuel was running critically low. Harold, the pilot, urged him to re-establish a connection, but they still couldn't get through. With no other option, Harold had to attempt a landing on the vast ocean. He told his crew to jettison all non-essential items, as they were about to run out of fuel. They braced for impact and landed in the immense sea. Harold's seatbelt unbuckled on impact, but Tony's and Gene's didn't. They began to sink with the aircraft. Just as they were about to be dragged deep underwater, their belts finally released, and they resurfaced next to Harold, who had managed to deploy an inflatable life raft. The 3 men climbed into the raft, but they had no food or water. Everything they needed was trapped inside the sinking aircraft. They were stranded in the boundless South Pacific, with no land in sight, but held on to the hope that the U.S. Navy would soon find and rescue them. And indeed, they soon spotted a U.S. Navy aircraft in the sky. Harold shouted to deploy the parachute into the water so the aircraft could spot them, as their raft was too small to be seen from such a height. But their parachute had sunk with the aircraft, and they didn't have a flare gun to signal their presence. They took off their life jackets and started waving them frantically, yelling for help. However, the aircraft was too far away to see them, and eventually flew off. Harold, the pilot, despaired, saying, "They came here to find us, and that was our last chance." Tony argued, "They can't leave us in this vast ocean." But Harold insisted that the Navy wouldn't search the same area repeatedly, meaning they had to find a way out themselves. Harold, the most senior among them, knew they were truly trapped. He told them to remove their shoes, as it was going to be a long journey. They all took off their shoes, but the raft was too small to store them. Harold said they'd have to throw their shoes overboard. Before we continue, I want to request that if you're watching this video, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. 99% of my viewers watch but don't subscribe or like, so please do. Tony and Gene threw their shoes into the ocean, but Harold kept his. Gene, surprised, asked why. Harold explained, "If we find land, one of us will need to walk, so we need to save 1 pair of feet." Their first day at sea passed without food or water. The biggest problem was the limited space on the raft, preventing them from all sleeping at once, so they took turns. That night, Harold asked if anyone wanted water. Tony and Gene looked at him in surprise. Harold then urinated into his shoe and drank it, knowing that finding water here would be incredibly difficult. The next morning, Harold informed them that they were drifting towards Hawaii, roughly 1,900 miles away, with South America 6,000 miles behind them. As a pilot, he had a good sense of direction. He said if they continued drifting, they might reach Hawaii in a few weeks. Tony and Gene were shocked. Tony exclaimed, "Even if we reach it, we'll die of hunger and thirst first." Gene suggested, "There are plenty of fish in the water, we need to do something." Among their limited supplies, they had a gun magazine with a spring. They fashioned a fishing hook from the spring and cast it into the water. Something immediately tugged at the line, but as they pulled, the line snapped, and the hook was gone. Gene remarked, "Someone in the water is hungrier than us." Despite being at sea, the heat was intense. Gene jumped into the water, unable to bear the heat any longer. Tony was about to follow, but Harold stopped him, saying he'd heard there were sharks in the water. When Gene heard this, he quickly scrambled back onto the raft. This meant they couldn't go into the water anymore. Days slowly passed. They had been on the raft for 5 days without food or water, and all 3 were extremely weak. When Tony could no longer stand it, he tried to drink seawater, but Harold stopped him, warning that it would only dehydrate his body further. The main reason for their predicament was that Harold, their pilot, had been flying west and had asked Gene for confirmation that they were going the right way. Jean had been told on the radio to go east, which is why they got lost. Due to running out of fuel, they were now stranded in the ocean. Suddenly, Harold remembered he had a pencil in his shirt pocket, which made him very happy. He pulled it out and declared, "We can make a chart to figure out exactly where we are." They began drawing a chart on their life raft. After determining their direction, Harold realized they needed to prevent their raft from drifting with the wind. They used their life jackets and other available items to create an anchor, which would stabilize their boat. This way, whenever they lifted the anchor, they would drift in the direction they desired. After making and deploying the anchor, they prayed. Jean then said, "We haven't done everything right in our lives, but we need your help." Harold prayed for all the boats in the ocean, including theirs. Tony added, "My friends are right, but what we need most here is rain. Please, let it rain." But it didn't rain, and Tony was disappointed. Jean told him to give God some time. Later that night, as they were all sleeping, it started to rain. After many days, they took their first sips of water, which brought immense relief, as their bodies were completely dehydrated. The next day, Jean was shown trying to catch fish for several days without success. Harold told him, "I've never seen a fisherman more patient than you. You've been trying to catch a fish for a week, but you haven't caught even one." Jean replied, "Where I come from, there's a saying, you don't catch, you don't eat." But Jean himself was frustrated. He pulled a knife from his pocket. Harold warned him, "How many times have I told you to always keep that knife in your pocket? It's the only thing we have that can puncture this boat." But Jean didn't listen and waited for a fish in the water. As soon as he saw one, he lunged at it with the knife. He thought he had stabbed the raft and cried, "I made a mistake, I stabbed the raft." Harold told him not to remove the knife, otherwise water would flood the raft and they would lose it. But then Jean realized he had stabbed a baby shark. He pulled it onto the raft, and together they killed it. They also found several small fish in its stomach. After a whole week, the three of them finally ate their first meal, which brought them not only joy but also renewed energy. Harold then said, "I'm going home now. My wife will be very angry with me." He asked Tony and Jean if they were married. They didn't know each other very well personally. Tony said he was married but had a girlfriend. Jean said he was neither married nor had a girlfriend. Tony told Jean, "When you go back, you should date my sister. She's beautiful." As they talked, they noticed many sharks circling their raft. Some of the shark pups' blood had spilled into the water, attracting them, but luckily, the sharks didn't harm their raft and eventually swam away. The South Pacific is famous for its sharks, and they could have easily capsized the raft and killed them all. But this time, they were lucky. Although they had food and water, as the days passed, they began to weaken again. One night, as Jean had his hand in the water, a shark attacked him, injuring his hand. Luckily, the injury wasn't severe. Another time, Jean thought he saw something in the distance. An island. He showed Tony, but Tony said it was just his imagination. They were starting to experience strange dreams. On the morning of the 15th day, Tony was seen holding his gun. Jean quietly whispered to him, "Give me your gun and don't make a sound." Tony handed him the gun. Jean then saw a bird sitting on the raft near Harold, who was sleeping. Jean shot the bird, but it fell into the ocean. When Harold saw that they had shot a bird, he jumped into the ocean after it. He reached the bird, but as he picked it up, he saw a shark approaching behind him. Harold quickly swam back to the raft, narrowly escaping becoming the shark's meal. The shark swam under the raft, and Harold was safe. They now had food again, the second time in 15 days. But as the days wore on, their minds also began to suffer. They all had strange dreams. It was now 20 days since they were stranded. When Harold woke up one morning, he saw that no one was on duty, meaning no one was checking the wind direction. He was furious. "I gave you orders, but you didn't follow them." Jean retorted, "There's nothing to see here, and we should have reached an island by now." "Where is that island?" Harold admitted, "I have a rough picture in my mind." Tony and Jean were shocked, realizing Harold wasn't even sure where they were. Jean accused Harold, "Because of you, we had to land in the ocean because you didn't know where our ship was. You took us too far away from our ship, which is why we were out of range and couldn't communicate with them." Harold confessed that he had fallen asleep for a few seconds while they were in the air. By the time he woke up, they had drifted far off course, out of range, and didn't know their location. With the fuel gone, they had to land in the ocean, and now all three were trapped. It was all Harold's fault, and he felt deep remorse. He apologized to them, tears in his eyes, but there was nothing they could do now. Jean picked up the map Harold had drawn on the life raft and said, "This is what will take us home now." Then Harold had an idea. He cut the soles off his shoes with Jean's knife, making 2 paddles so they could steer the raft in their desired direction. Tony then joked, "Whoever spots the first island will get dinner from the other 2 at their favorite place." But their journey wasn't easy. More days passed. It had now been 30 days in the ocean, and they were too weak to even speak. They were thirsty, hungry, and had lost all motivation. That night, it started to rain again, providing them with water. But then they saw a huge storm approaching. They were caught in the storm. Their raft capsized, and Tony, who couldn't swim, was lost. But then they saw Tony on the other side of the boat. They righted the raft, and with great difficulty, one by one, everyone climbed back onto it. This is how they survived the dangerous storm. The next morning, the 3 were utterly exhausted. The few belongings they had were lost in the sea during the night. They had given up all hope of survival, lying on the raft like living corpses. They missed their homes. Harold was thinking of his wife. Jean hallucinated and saw Tony's sister sitting in the ocean, based on Tony's description of her. He told Tony, "I think I'm in love with your sister." Tony replied, "You 2 would make a great couple." Harold, hearing all this, was very sad. He said, "I didn't know it would end like this. Forgive me." Harold was blaming himself, but then Tony struggled to sit up and said, "We've come too far, and we can't give up like this." He started paddling the boat with his hands. Seeing him, the other 2 also sat up and did the same. But no matter how much they tried to motivate themselves, their bodies had no energy left. After 34 days, they were completely worn out, almost dead. They couldn't even speak. In this state, Tony said, "I had a dream where I saw a big green field." Harold replied, "I've had that dream twice." Then Harold picked up some seawater and started drinking it, believing he wouldn't survive. Just then, Jean, who was lying in front of him, said, "I see something green in front of me." When all 3 looked up, they saw an island. Seeing it, they were filled with joy and energy. After 34 days at sea, they had finally reached a small island. They started pushing the boat towards it with all their might. Moments later, the 3 of them reached the shore. After 34 days, they touched land, which brought them immense relief. There were 2 huts on the beach, and they all walked towards them. Thus, their difficult journey ended on February 20th, 1942, when they reached a beach called Puka Puka. They survived because they never gave up hope during their arduous journey. Hope is something that teaches you to fight and move forward in life. It brings passion into your heart, and it was this passion that saved these 3 men. Finally, it is revealed that these 3 men traveled more than 10,000 miles in that small raft. Harold received an award from the Navy for expertly leading his crew through this difficult journey, but none of them ever flew an aircraft again. After fully recovering, Tony continued his career in the Navy, and when he died in 1986, his ashes were scattered over the ocean. Jean also worked in radio during the war, and in 1946, he married Tony's sister, Frances. The movie concludes by showing real pictures of the 3 men, illustrating how far they had traveled in 34 days at sea. This is the end of this true story. Which movie's story would you like to hear next? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more such videos.